The hum of the diner's neon sign was the only sound in the desert night. A warm glow flickered against the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, illuminating a handful of empty cars and the dust swirling in the dry air. Inside, the diner was a quiet sanctuary. Old booths with peeling red vinyl, the low murmur of a country song playing from a dusty jukebox, and the comforting scent of coffee, bacon, and warm pie filling the space. Sarah Red Callahan stood behind the counter, drying a coffee mug with slow, practiced movements. Her hands were calloused, worn from years of work, but not from this kind of work. Before the diner, before this attempt at a quiet life, those hands had done something very different, something far away, in places most people never dared think about. But that was the past. She glanced at the clock. 11:42 p.m. Almost closing time. The place was mostly empty, just old Frank, the trucker who had been stopping by for years, hunched over his plate of hash browns, and Lena, the young waitress, leaning against the counter, absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. The world was quiet until the noise came. Engines, loud, guttural, rolling in like a storm. Sarah knew that sound too well. Lena perked up, frowning. What the hell? The hum of the motorcycles grew, multiplied until it was right outside. The low, throaty rumble settled into a dull vibration against the diner's windows. The jukebox skipped, the old wiring flickering under the sudden weight of the noise. Then came the laughter, the kind that wasn't friendly. Frank muttered under his breath, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Damn fools! Sarah just watched. The door swung open with force, the ding of the bell almost laughable in comparison to what followed. 5 of them at first, stepping in like they owned the place. More waiting outside, still on their bikes. The leader, Razor, tall, lean, but built like steel wire, his face a mess of old scars. A serpent tattoo curled around his neck, disappearing under the collar of his cut-off leather vest. Dead eyes. He took one long look around, exhaling through his nose like he could smell the fear in the air. Behind him, his men spread out, boots heavy against the tile. They weren't here for food. Sarah stayed still. Lena, though, wasn't as good at hiding it. Razor noticed. Well, he said, his voice lazy, amused. Ain't this a cozy little place? No one answered. One of the bikers, Grim, the big one with a grin full of bad teeth, kicked a chair aside, plopping down like he'd just claimed his throne. The others followed, settling in like they were here to stay. Frank sighed, pushing his plate away. Ain't got time for this, he muttered. He dropped a few bills on the table and stood up. He didn't make it far. One of the bikers, a younger one, stepped in front of him. You don't want to stay for the fun, old man? Frank stopped, his jaw clenched. He wasn't a fighter, never had been. Sarah watched his fingers twitch, his body tensing. She knew the signs of a man about to make a mistake. Before he could open his mouth, Sarah spoke. Let him go. The room stilled. Razor turned toward her, his attention shifting for the first time. He looked her up and down, eyes lingering on her posture, the way she stood, too steady, too balanced. And who might you be? Sarah met his gaze, unblinking. Owner, Razor smiled. That right? This your little kingdom? Something like that. He chuckled. And you think you run this place? Sarah didn't blink. I know I do. The silence stretched. Then he laughed. The others joined in, the sound grating, mocking. Well, ain't that something? Razor grinned, stepping closer, placing both hands on the counter, leaning in like he was talking to an old friend. She didn't move. See, I got a little rule, Razor continued. When me and my boys roll into a town, we don't like to be disrespected. And right now, lady, I feel like maybe, just maybe, you don't respect us. Sarah reached for the coffee pot, slow, steady, poured herself a cup, took a sip, then set it down like she had all the time in the world. If you were looking for respect, she said, voice even, cold, you should have tried earning it. The laughter stopped. Grim pushed his chair back, his expression dark now. The younger ones, the cocky ones, the dumb ones, shifted, waiting for the inevitable. Razor's grin faded, his jaw flexed. Sarah could see the exact moment he made the decision. He grabbed the coffee mug in front of her and smashed it against the counter. The shards clattered to the floor, coffee pooling around them. Lena let out a sharp breath, backing away. The trucker, still standing near the door, moved slow, like a man debating whether to stay or run. Razor leaned in closer, his breath hot, his voice lower now, dripping with amusement. "See, lady, here's how this is gonna go. You're gonna be real polite, pour my boys around, and we're gonna enjoy our night. And you're gonna sit your pretty ass down and keep your mouth shut." Sarah held his stare. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up and untied her apron, folded it, set it neatly on the counter, and rolled up her sleeves. Razor noticed the tattoo on her forearm, an old one, faded, military. He didn't recognize it, but he should have. Sarah flexed her fingers, loosening her shoulders. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, voice calm. Razor smirked. "Lady, you have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah nodded like she'd just gotten confirmation on something. "Yeah," she murmured, "that's what I was thinking." And then, before he could react, she moved. Her fist collided with his gut, sharp, fast, brutal. The whole room erupted into chaos. Razor let out a choked gasp as Sarah's fist sank deep into his gut, the impact knocking the air from his lungs like a gut punch from a freight train. His body doubled forward, instinctively folding over the pain, but she wasn't done. Not even close. Before he could recover, Sarah snatched his wrist, twisted it with brutal efficiency, and slammed his face down onto the counter. The sound was sickening. Glass rattled, the force of the impact sending a half-empty salt shaker tumbling onto the floor. Silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, all at once, the hellhounds erupted into action. Grim was the first to react. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he lunged forward, his massive frame moving faster than expected for a man his size. Sarah ducked at the last second, twisting away as his thick arm swung wildly past her head. His momentum carried him forward, slamming his knee into a bar stool, throwing him off balance. She used that split second, stepped in, dropped low, drove her elbow into the back of his knee. Grim howled, crumpling down onto one leg. Then Sarah grabbed the back of his greasy head and smashed it into the counter, right where Razor's blood was already pooling. The diner exploded into chaos. A younger biker, one of the cocky ones, pulled a knife. He was fast, but not fast enough. Sarah sidestepped, snatching a metal coffee pot off the burner, and swung it hard. The scalding hot liquid splashed into his face, and he screamed, clutching his eyes as he stumbled backward. His knife clattered to the floor, forgotten in his panic. Lena, frozen in shock, let out a strangled breath. "Holy!" "Get behind the counter!" Sarah barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. Lena scrambled away just as another biker lunged, this one swinging a length of rusted chain. Sarah caught the first strike with her forearm, pain flaring instantly, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. She ripped the chain from his hands, twisted it around her forearm, and with a sharp yank, sent the man stumbling forward, right into her waiting knee. Bone crunched. He collapsed, groaning, hands clutching his shattered nose. Sarah barely had time to breathe before the youngest of the bikers, a wiry, tattooed punk, grabbed a glass sugar jar and hurled it straight at her head. She ducked, just barely, the glass shattering against the register behind her. Before she could recover, he charged, fists swinging wildly. He had no technique, just rage. That was his mistake. Sarah let him come. At the last second, she stepped aside, caught his arm mid-swing, and used his momentum against him, flipping him clean over her hip. His back slammed into the floor hard. He wheezed, gasping for breath, body twitching from the impact. And then there was only one left standing. Razor. He had pulled himself upright, his face a mess of blood and fury, his lips curled in a snarl, his breathing ragged, his pride shattered into pieces. "You," he hissed, wiping at his nose with the back of his hand. "You stupid—" Sarah grabbed a steak knife off the counter and flung it. It sank into the wall a mere inch from Razor's head. He froze. Sarah stepped forward, her knuckles still bloodied, her breathing steady, like she hadn't just taken out half his crew in under 2 minutes. "You're done," she said, her voice like iron. Razor's jaw clenched, his hands trembled at his sides, not with fear, with rage. But deep in his eyes, Sarah saw it, that flicker of doubt, that moment where he realized this fight was over, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Sarah took another step closer. You take your boys, what's left of them, and you leave. Right now? Grim groaned from the floor. Another biker spat blood into his palm. The kid who had gone through the table wasn't moving much at all. The fight was already decided. But Razor? Razor was the kind of man who couldn't let things go. He reached for his belt. Sarah saw it. She moved before he could pull the gun. She closed the distance in an instant, grabbed his wrist, and bent it back at an unnatural angle. The gun clattered to the floor. Razor howled in pain, dropping to one knee, his body shaking from the sudden, white-hot agony of Sarah's grip. She crouched, bringing her face level with his. "I said, you're done!" Razor gasped, nodding through clenched teeth. Sarah let go, standing up, watching as he cradled his wrist. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "You have no idea who we are." Sarah wiped the blood from her knuckles on a napkin. "I don't care." Razor spat at the floor, humiliated. He turned toward his fallen men, his voice sharp and ragged. "Get up, we're leaving." No one argued. The hellhounds staggered toward the door, dragging their wounded, their cocky grins long gone. As they stepped outside, Sarah watched, unmoving, waiting to see if Razor was really dumb enough to try again. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time. His eyes burned with hatred. "This ain't over," he promised, his voice low, dangerous. Sarah leaned against the counter, tilting her head. "Yeah, it is." Razor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then, with a roar of engines, the hellhounds vanished into the desert night. The diner was silent once more. Lena peeked out from behind the counter, her eyes wide. "Jesus Christ." Sarah sighed, rolling her shoulders. The adrenaline was starting to wear off. The aches would set in soon. She walked back behind the counter, reached for the coffee pot, and poured herself another cup. "You okay?" Lena asked, still a little breathless. Sarah took a slow sip. "I've had worse nights." Lena stared at her. "What the hell did you do before this?" Sarah smirked, tapping a scarred knuckle against the counter. "Cooked?" Lena huffed a small, nervous laugh. "Yeah, sure." Sarah lifted her cup. The coffee was still warm. Finally, peace. For now. The silence in the diner stretched long after the roar of the bikes had faded into the distance. Sarah stood behind the counter, rolling her wrist, feeling the dull ache settling in. It had been a while since she'd had to use her hands for something other than flipping burgers and pouring coffee. Lena hadn't moved much, still gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "They'll come back," she murmured. Sarah exhaled slowly, setting her coffee cup down. "I know." Lena shook her head, her voice rising. "No, I mean, they won't just walk in next time. They'll come back with more guys, guns maybe. You just humiliated them." Sarah met her gaze, steady and unreadable. "Then, we'll be ready." Lena let out a hollow laugh, incredulous. "We? Sarah, you might be some kind of ninja or whatever, but I'm not. And neither is Frank or any of the people who eat here. We're just trying to live our damn lives." Frank, still seated in the corner, cleared his throat. "Well, to be fair, Red's been trying to live hers too. Didn't exactly ask for this, now did she?" Lena threw up her hands. "That's not the point." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew what Lena was saying. She had felt it too, once. That moment where your life turns a corner, where you realize something is coming, that you might not be able to stop. But she had made her choice when she stepped into this fight. And now? Now she had to finish it. She reached for her old flip phone and flipped it open, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a voice, low and amused, answered. "Didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." Sarah leaned against the counter, watching the headlights of a lone car roll past the diner outside. "Yeah, well, life's full of surprises." The voice on the other end chuckled. "How bad?" She glanced around at the wreckage in the diner, chairs overturned, blood drying on the counter, shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. "Bad enough?" A pause. Then, "You need backup?" Sarah thought about it. Thought about the gang out there, licking their wounds, stewing in their humiliation. She knew men like Razor, knew their type too well. They wouldn't just take their loss and move on, they would come back. And when they did, she'd have to end this. "Yeah," she said into the phone. "I need backup." The voice on the other end let out a slow, knowing sigh. "All right, where do you need us?" Sarah looked at the clock. Midnight now. If she was right, the hellhounds wouldn't wait till morning. "Come quick," she said. "We don't have much time." She hung up. Lena was watching her, arms crossed. "Who the hell was that?" Sarah grabbed a rag and started wiping the blood from the counter. "Someone who owes me a favor." Frank huffed a quiet laugh. "Must be one hell of a favor." Sarah didn't answer. She just waited. And soon in the distance, the sound of motorcycles rumbled once more. They were coming back. But this time, Sarah wasn't alone. The night air was heavy with the scent of dust and gasoline. The hum of the returning engines grew louder, closer, rolling in like a storm about to break. Sarah stood by the counter, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the worn surface, her body still as stone, waiting. Frank sat back in his booth, muttering, "Well, ain't this something?" He didn't look scared, just resigned. Like he had been through his own share of hell and knew when a fight was unavoidable. Lena, standing near the kitchen entrance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, whispered, "We should call the cops." Sarah didn't take her eyes off the dark highway beyond the diner windows. "They won't get here in time." The motorcycles roared closer, then stopped. Engines cut. Silence. Sarah walked to the door and flipped the lock open before they even knocked. When she stepped outside, the hellhounds were waiting. They had come back all right, and they had come prepared. More bikes, more men, more firepower. Razor was at the front, his face still bruised and swollen from where she had put him down. His pride was gone, replaced with pure hatred. Sarah saw the change in him immediately. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war. "You should have left town," Razor growled. His voice was calmer than before, too calm, like a man who had already decided on violence. Sarah exhaled through her nose, unmoved. "You should have stayed down." Behind Razor, his men shifted restlessly. They had bats, chains, knives. Some had pistols tucked into their belts. The streetlight cast them in long, twisting shadows. Sarah didn't blink. Didn't show one damn ounce of fear. Then another sound joined the night. A second set of engines. Not as many this time, but different, heavier, meaner. Razor's smug expression twitched when the first black truck rolled in, then another, then a third. Sarah heard the doors open before she saw them step out. Reaper was first, big, bearded, built like he was carved out of stone. A former ranger, a man who had walked away from war but had never forgotten how to fight one. Behind him, 3 more men. Each of them carried themselves the way only soldiers did. Their eyes scanned the hellhounds with cold, measured calculation. Sarah crossed her arms. "Took you long enough?" Reaper grinned. "Had to stop for coffee." Razor's cocky bravado faltered. He was outnumbered before. Now he was outclassed. "You don't know what you just did," Razor growled. Reaper tilted his head. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing." The night held for a single suspended second. Then the first gunshot rang out. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Reaper. It was one of Razor's men, panicked, reaching too fast. He pulled his pistol, fired once, but missed. That was the only shot he got off. Sarah moved first. She kicked the side of a fallen chair, sending it sliding across the pavement, straight into the shooter's legs. He stumbled, his gun tilting wildly as he tried to regain balance. Reaper didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in a blink, grabbed the man's wrist, and snapped it. The pistol hit the ground before the biker even registered the pain. Then the real fight began. Sarah caught the first biker who lunged at her, a big guy with a crowbar. She sidestepped, let his swing carry forward, then drove her elbow into his throat. Reaper was a wrecking machine. He moved through them like a ghost, precise and brutal, snapping arms, dislocating shoulders, putting men on the ground before they even realized they had lost. Razor, snarling like a rabid dog, charged Sarah himself. She met him halfway. He swung, she ducked. He reached for his knife. She grabbed his wrist and twisted. His knee came up. She blocked with her forearm, then countered with a savage kick to his ribs. Razor staggered back, gasping. "You..." Sarah grabbed him by his vest and slammed him face first into the side of a truck. Razor hit the pavement hard, coughing, spitting blood. His men? The ones still standing? They ran. The ones who could, anyway. It was over before it even began. Sarah stood over Razor, breathing steady. He rolled onto his back, staring up at her, his rage flickering into something colder. "You think this ends here?" he rasped, wiping blood from his lip. Sarah crouched, eyes narrowing. "I don't think. I know." He gritted his teeth. "You don't kill me now, I'll just come back." Sarah smiled. "Number, you won't." Razor's lips parted slightly, about to ask why. Then Reaper crouched beside Sarah. He didn't say anything. He just pulled back his leather jacket enough to show the pistol tucked in his belt. A quiet promise. Razor swallowed hard. Real fear crept into his face for the first time. Sarah leaned in close. "You ride out of here, you never come back. You so much as breathe near this diner again, and the next time you see us, it won't be a warning." Razor knew she meant it. He nodded once. "Understood." Sarah stood up, taking a slow breath. "Good. Now get the hell off my lot." Razor pushed himself up, stumbling, clutching his ribs. He whistled once, a sharp pain sound. The remaining hellhounds, what was left of them, hurried to their bikes. No more posturing, no more threats. Engines fired up. Then, one by one, they rode away into the night. Sarah exhaled. Lena, watching from the diner doorway, let out a long, shaky breath. Holy shit. Frank, still seated inside, finally lifted his coffee. "Told you she could handle it." Reaper clapped a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Still got it, Red." Sarah smirked, shaking her head. "I never lost it." She turned toward the diner, stretching out her arms, feeling the soreness creeping in. She glanced at the busted chairs, the scattered glass, the absolute mess they had left behind. Lena raised an eyebrow. "You seriously going back to work after all that?" Sarah shrugged, stepping inside. "Diner ain't gonna run itself." She grabbed a fresh coffee pot, poured herself a cup, and leaned against the counter. Finally, peace for now.